Every mother in England had heard the news. The new Duke of Kelvinridge was coming to town at last, 35, unmarried, grieving, and in want of a wife. From the moment he opened the great house in Berkeley Square, he was hunted. He was flattered at every dinner, waylaid in every ballroom, and presented with the loveliest and most accomplished daughters the season could produce. And he turned away from all of them, 100 bright arrows aimed at a man who had long since stopped believing any of them saw him at all, rather than his title and his fortune. And then, at a crowded ball where every eye in the room followed him, he saw the one woman who did not look up. Her name was Frances Meredith, and she was hidden in the farthest corner of Lady Ashworth's ballroom, sitting on a small gilt chair with a book of poetry balanced on her lap as though she were in her own quiet library and not surrounded by the most glittering assembly of the season. She was not beautiful. Her hair was a soft brown without any remarkable curl, her nose a little too long, her chin a little too decided. Her gown was a pale grey-blue silk that had been turned and ret-rimmed so many times that the candlelight caught the faint lines of old stitches. She was 25, a gentleman's daughter of small fortune and no particular ambition, and she had come to London not to find a husband, but to keep her younger sister company while their mother hunted one. She had no interest in dukes. She barely glanced up when the Duke of Kelvinridge entered the room, even though the air itself seemed to shift and shimmer with the sudden intake of breath from 100 eager ladies. She merely turned a page and continued reading, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips moving silently over a line of verse. The Duke noticed. He noticed because for 2 long years, every woman he met had looked at him with the same calculating hunger, the same glittering awareness of his title, his land, his fortune. They smiled too widely, laughed too readily, agreed with everything he said. They arranged themselves like flowers in a vase, each one hoping to be plucked. And he had grown so tired of being a prize that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be a man. But the woman in the corner with her worn gown and her book of poetry did not look up. She did not preen or flutter or cast him a single sidelong glance. She was utterly indifferent to his presence, and in that indifference, she was the most honest person in the room. So the Duke of Kelvinridge did something no one expected. He crossed the ballroom floor, cutting through the sea of silk and jewels, past the frozen smiles of matchmaking mothers and the astonished faces of their daughters, and he stopped directly in front of the one woman who had ignored him. "Good evening," he said. Frances Meredith looked up at last, and for one breathless moment, her clear grey eyes met his without a trace of flattery or guile. She blinked once, as though surprised to find a duke standing before her, and then she did something even more unexpected. She closed her book with a soft snap and said, quite calmly, "Have you lost your way, Your Grace? The dancers are that way." He almost smiled. It was the first time in years a woman had spoken to him without a hidden blade behind her words. "I am not lost," he said. "I came to ask if you would do me the honor of a turn about the room." She studied him for a moment, and he felt as though she were seeing straight through the fine black coat and the starched cravat to the weary man beneath. Then she shook her head. "I am afraid I do not dance. I have never been any good at it, and I dislike making a spectacle of myself." "Then perhaps you would walk with me in the garden," he said. "It is quieter there, and we might speak without being overheard." A faint flush rose to her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Your Grace, I am not the sort of woman you should be seen with in a garden. My reputation is not much, but it is all I have. I assure you," he said quietly, "I have no intention of damaging it. I only wish to talk to someone who does not look at me as though I were a prize horse at auction." Something flickered in her eyes then, a spark of understanding that had nothing to do with pity. She set her book aside, rose from her chair, and placed her hand on his offered arm. The touch was light, impersonal, but it sent a strange current through him all the same. Together they walked toward the French doors that led to the terrace, and behind them the ballroom erupted into a storm of whispers that neither of them bothered to acknowledge. Alexander Blackwood, 5th Duke of Kelvinridge, had been walking through the world half asleep for 2 years, ever since the cold morning when they carried his wife's body back from the East Wood, her neck broken and her beautiful face still wearing an expression of startled fury. Catherine had been riding alone, or so everyone believed, and her horse had thrown her at the bottom of a steep ravine. The coroner called it a tragic accident. The Ton called it grief enough to last a lifetime. And Alexander called it the moment his heart turned to stone. He had married Catherine when he was 28 and she was 20, a dazzling diamond of the first water who had smiled at him across a ballroom and made him believe in love. But the marriage had been a disaster almost from the start. Catherine was passionate, restless, easily bored, and she had never forgiven him for not being the romantic hero she had imagined. She flirted openly, spent his money recklessly, and filled their great house with laughter that always seemed to mock him. They quarreled bitterly in private, and in public she played the devoted wife so skillfully that no one suspected the emptiness behind her smiles. He had loved her, or thought he did, until he realized that what she loved was the title, the jewels, the adoration, and not the man who provided them. The morning she died, they had argued again. She had wanted to go to London for the season, and he had refused because her recent behavior with a young baron had already caused talk. She had screamed that he was a cold, heartless tyrant, and then she had ridden out into the rain, her horse skidding on the wet grass, and by the time they found her, it was too late. He had not wept. He had simply felt a great, hollow emptiness open up inside him, and he had been carrying it ever since. Now, 2 years later, he had come to London because his sister Margaret insisted it was time. He had no intention of finding a new wife, but the world would not leave him alone. Every mother, every daughter, every ambitious widow saw him as the greatest prize of the season, and he had learned to deflect their advances with cold politeness and a carefully guarded heart. Until tonight. Until the woman with the gray eyes and the worn gown looked at him as though he were merely a man, and not a duke at all. The garden was cool and fragrant with the scent of late-blooming roses. Lanterns hung from the branches of ancient oaks, casting soft pools of golden light onto the gravel paths. Frances walked beside him in silence for a long moment, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. At last, she spoke. "You are wondering why I was reading poetry in a ballroom," she said. "I confess I am curious," he replied. "Because my mother insisted I attend, and I have never been able to endure hours of standing against the wall watching prettier girls dance. I brought a book to keep myself company." She paused. "It was that or fall asleep, and I have been told that snoring in public is unbecoming in a lady." This time, he did smile. It felt unfamiliar on his face, like a muscle that had not been used in a very long time. "You are very direct." "I have nothing to lose by being honest," she said simply. "I am not here to catch a husband. I am here to watch my sister Charlotte, who is far lovelier than I and stands a much better chance. I am 25, Your Grace. In the marriage market, that makes me practically invisible. So I may say what I please, and no one cares enough to be offended." "I find that hard to believe," he said, and meant it. She glanced up at him, her expression skeptical. "You need not flatter me. I know what I am. I have a small dowry and a plain face. I have been told often enough that I am too clever for my own good and not nearly charming enough to make up for it. I have made my peace with spinsterhood." Something in her words touched a raw, unguarded place inside him. "Then you are the only honest woman in London," he said. "I have spent 2 years surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. They smile and agree and flatter, and every one of them wants something from me. But you—" He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You do not even look at me as though I matter." She considered him gravely. "You matter as a man. I am sure you are a very good one. But I have never been impressed by titles. My father is a baronet, and we have lived on the edge of poverty my whole life. A title does not keep the roof from leaking or the fire from going cold. I have learned to judge people by their character, not their rank." He stared at her, and in the soft lantern light, something shifted in his memory. A half-forgotten image stirred in the back of his mind, a girl in a faded muslin dress, standing under an apple tree, a book in her hand and laughter in her eyes. It was the summer after his father died, when he had fled Kelvinridge and hidden himself in a friend's hunting box in Yorkshire, too raw with grief to face the world. There had been a country assembly, and he had gone reluctantly, and a young girl had talked to him as though he were nobody at all. She had asked him about his favorite books and told him he looked sad, and she had made him feel, for one evening, like a human being again. He had never learned her name. She had been gone the next day, and he had thought of her often in the years that followed, as a kind of talisman against loneliness. Now, looking at Frances Meredith's calm, plain face and steady gray eyes, he felt the shock of recognition hit him like a wave. It was her. The girl from Yorkshire. Older now, her features sharper, her expression more guarded, but unmistakably the same. "Have we met before?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She frowned, searching his face. "I do not think so. I would remember meeting a duke." "Would you?" He smiled a little bitterly. "I was not always so easily recognized. 8 years ago, I spent a summer in Yorkshire. I attended a small dance in a village hall, and I spoke with a girl who told me I looked like I needed a friend." Frances went very still. The color drained from her face, and then rushed back in a flood of pink. "That was you?" she whispered. "The sad young man who could not stop frowning at the punch bowl?" "I was not frowning at the punch bowl," he said. "I was frowning at life. And you asked me if I had ever read Wordsworth, and when I said no, you lectured me for a quarter of an hour on the importance of poetry for a troubled soul." She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I remember. I was 17, and I had no idea you were anyone important. My great-aunt lived near there, and I was staying with her for the summer. You told me your name was Alex." "It is. Alexander Blackwood. I had not yet learned to hide behind my title." He watched her closely, seeing the memories flicker across her face. "You were the first person in a long time who spoke to me as though I were a man, not a duke in training. I never forgot you." "Neither did I," she admitted softly. "I thought of you often. You seemed so lonely, and I wished I could have done more to help." She shook her head, as though trying to clear it. "But that was years ago. I am not that girl anymore." "No," he agreed. "You are the woman who ignored me in a ballroom. And I find I am just as drawn to you now as I was then." She took a step back, her composure cracking for the first time. "Your Grace, you must not say such things. You are a duke, and I am a nobody. The world will not be kind if you show me any particular attention." "I have never cared much for the world's kindness," he said. "And you are not a nobody. You are the only woman in London who sees me clearly, and I am not willing to let that go. Before she could protest, he offered her his arm again. "Come. Let us walk a little more, and you can tell me whether you still prefer Wordsworth to Byron. I seem to recall you had very strong opinions on the subject." Despite herself, Frances laughed. It was a small, startled sound, as though she had not expected to find anything amusing tonight. "Very well," she said. "But if you tell anyone that I lectured a duke on poetry, I shall deny it to my dying breath." They walked on through the garden, and the ballroom behind them glittered on, forgotten. Inside, Lady Honoria Pemberton stood at the edge of the dance floor, her beautiful face a mask of cold fury. Lady Honoria was 30 years old, a widow of 3 years, and she had been planning to become the next Duchess of Kelvinridge since the day Catherine Blackwood was buried. She had been Catherine's closest friend, or so the world believed, and she had played the role of grieving confidante so perfectly that Alexander had come to rely on her. He did not know that Honoria had secretly despised Catherine for her careless beauty and her easy hold on a man Honoria wanted for herself. He did not know that Honoria had been present the morning Catherine died, that she had ridden out after her and exchanged words that no one else had heard. He did not know that Honoria still had a packet of letters locked in her writing desk, letters in Catherine's own hand, confessing a passionate affair with a footman and a plan to run away to Italy. Those letters were Honoria's greatest weapon. She had used them once already to secure Alexander's trust, offering sympathy and discretion while planting the seed that any public revelation would destroy Catherine's memory and his own honor. She had bided her time, waiting for the right moment to suggest that marriage to a loyal, understanding woman would silence any remaining whispers. She had imagined herself mistress of Kelvinridge, draped in emeralds, with Alexander's gratitude and his fortune at her feet. And now she watched him walk into the garden with a plain, penniless spinster who had not even the decency to be awed by him. Her gloved fingers curled into fists. She would not tolerate this. She had worked too hard, waited too long, to lose everything to a nobody like Francis Meredith. She turned to the man standing beside her, a portly gentleman with a red face and greedy eyes. Mr. Reginald Croft had made his fortune in trade and was desperate to buy his way into the gentry. He had been sniffing around the edges of the ballroom all evening, looking for a suitable wife with a pedigree but no money, and Honoria had taken note. "Mr. Croft," she said smoothly, "I wonder if I might have a word with you. I believe we can help each other." Croft's small eyes lit up. "Lady Honoria, I am always at your service. What did you have in mind?" She smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips. "I have noticed a certain young lady here tonight. A Miss Frances Meredith. Her family is respectable but impoverished. Her father is Sir John Meredith, a baronet with mounting debts. I think you might find her useful." "A spinster?" Croft frowned. "I need a wife who can give me heirs, my lady. And she doesn't look like much. She has a small inheritance from her grandmother, enough to cover her dowry, and her father is desperate for funds. If you were to offer to settle his debts in exchange for her hand, I am sure the family would be most grateful." Honoria's smile sharpened. "And I would be most grateful to you. I have reasons for wanting Miss Meredith safely married and out of the way. I would make it worth your while." Croft considered this, his greedy mind turning over the possibilities. A baronet's daughter, even a plain one, would give him the social standing he craved. And if a powerful lady like Honoria Pemberton owed him a favor, so much the better. "I'll pay a call on Sir John tomorrow," he said. "What exactly do you need me to do?" "Simply marry her," Honoria said. "As quickly as possible. And ensure she does not interfere with my plans for the Duke." She did not add that she had another, darker purpose in mind. If Frances Meredith married a man like Reginald Croft, she would be trapped in a miserable union that would crush her spirit. And if Alexander tried to intervene, Honoria would use Catherine's letters to stop him. Either way, the Duke would be reminded that his heart was not his own to give. The garden path curved toward a small fountain, and Alexander and Frances paused beside it. The water murmured softly, drowning out the distant strains of the orchestra. Frances had fallen silent, her thoughts churning. She was acutely aware of the Duke's presence beside her, the warmth of his arm under her hand, the intensity of his dark eyes whenever he looked at her. It was disorienting, like stepping into a dream and finding it solid underfoot. "I still cannot believe it is you," she said at last. "The young man I met in Yorkshire. I thought of you as a friend, you know. I never expected to see you again, certainly not as a duke." "I wanted to find you," Alexander admitted. "After that night, I asked about you, but no one knew your name. You had vanished like a ghost. I thought perhaps I had imagined you." "I went back to my great-aunt's house that very night," Frances said. "My father sent word that my mother was ill, and I had to return home at once. I never even said goodbye. And now, here you are. 8 years later, ignoring me in a ballroom." He shook his head, a strange tenderness in his expression. "You have not changed as much as you think." Frances looked down at her faded gown. "I have changed in every way that matters. I was young and hopeful then. I thought the world was full of possibilities. Now I know it is full of debts and disappointments and endless, polite humiliation. Your family is in difficulty?" She hesitated, then nodded. "My father is a good man, but he has never been practical. He invested in a scheme that failed, and we have been struggling ever since. My mother is desperate for Charlotte to marry well, because it may be our only hope. And she stopped, her voice catching. "I do what I can. I teach Charlotte, I manage the household accounts, I try to stretch every shilling. But it is never enough. We are drowning, slowly, and no one outside our family even notices." "I notice," Alexander said quietly. "I have more money than I can spend in a lifetime, and it has never brought me a moment of real happiness. If I could, I would give you every penny to ease your burdens." "I do not want your charity," she said, a flash of pride in her eyes. "I have managed this long without a duke's pity." "It is not pity. It is admiration. You have endured hardship without losing your honesty or your dignity. That is rarer than you know." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, leather-bound case. "I want to show you something." He opened it, and inside was a miniature portrait, carefully painted on ivory. It showed a girl of about 17, with soft brown hair and a book in her hand, standing under the dappled shade of an apple tree. Her smile was gentle and a little sad, and her gray eyes looked out at the world with quiet courage. Frances stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. "That is me," she whispered. When did you?" "I drew it from memory," Alexander said. "The night after the dance. I have carried it with me ever since. It reminded me that somewhere in the world, there was a person who saw me as I truly was, and not as a title. When things were darkest, I would look at it and remember that honesty still existed." Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "I did not know. I never imagined. How could you? I was just a sad young man who needed a friend. You gave me that, and it meant more than you will ever know." He closed the case and tucked it away. When I saw you tonight, I felt as though I had been given a second chance. I do not know what this is, Francis, but I know I am not ready to let you walk out of my life again." She was trembling, her carefully constructed walls crumbling around her. "This is madness. We have only just met, and you are a duke, and I am nothing. The world will tear us apart." "Then let it try," he said. "I have spent 2 years letting the world dictate my life. I am done with that. I want to know you, Francis Meredith. Truly know you. If you will let me." She looked up at him, and in the dim lantern light, he saw the battle in her eyes, fear, hope, longing, and a stubborn resolve that would not be easily defeated. At last, she gave a small, shaky nod. "Very well," she said. "But I warn you, I am not a comfortable person to know. I speak my mind, and I do not flatter, and I am very bad at pretending to be something I am not. That," he said softly, "is exactly why I cannot stay away." They walked back to the ballroom together, and every eye in the room followed them. The whispers rose like a swarm of bees, but Frances held her head high, and Alexander walked beside her with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The following morning, Frances sat in the cramped parlor of her family's rented house in a shabby corner of Mayfair, trying to ignore the pounding in her temples. Her mother, Lady Meredith, had been interrogating her since breakfast. "The Duke of Kelvinridge. In the garden. And you did not think to inform me last night?" Lady Meredith was a thin, anxious woman with the remains of great beauty and a permanently worried expression. She paced the room, her skirts rustling against the faded carpet. "Do you have any idea what this could mean? If he has taken a fancy to you—" "He has not taken a fancy to me," Frances said wearily. "We merely talked. He was being polite." "Dukes are never polite to penniless spinsters without a reason," her mother snapped. "You must encourage him. This could be our salvation. Think of your sister. If you marry a duke, Charlotte could have her pick of husbands." Frances closed her eyes. "Mama, please. I am not going to marry the Duke of Kelvinridge. He is grieving his wife, and he is surrounded by women far more suitable than I. Whatever interest he showed last night was a passing whim." Charlotte, a pretty girl of 19 with honey-colored curls and wide blue eyes, looked up from her embroidery. "I think it is romantic. A duke who defies society to walk in the garden with a lady nobody else notices. It is like a fairy story." "Fairy stories are for children," Frances said. "In the real world, dukes marry heiresses and beautiful debutantes. They do not marry overlooked spinsters with £500 to their name." Before her mother could argue further, there was a knock at the door, and the maid entered with a silver salver bearing a single, cream-colored card. Lady Meredith snatched it up and let out a gasp. "It is from His Grace. He is calling this afternoon. At 3 o'clock. She pressed a hand to her heart. "Oh, my nerves. We must prepare. Charlotte, change into your blue muslin. Frances, for heaven's sake, put on something that does not look like it has been mended a dozen times." Frances took the card with a hand that was not quite steady. Her heart was beating too fast, and a strange, impossible hope was unfurling in her chest. She had told herself all night that the Duke's attention was a fleeting thing, that he would wake this morning and forget her. But he had not forgotten. He was coming here, to this shabby little house, because he wanted to see her. She did not know whether to laugh or weep. At precisely 3 o'clock, a grand black carriage drew up outside the Merediths' rented house, and a footman in silver livery jumped down to open the door. Alexander Blackwood emerged, impeccably dressed in a dark blue coat and buff breeches, his expression unreadable. He looked up at the modest house with its peeling paint and narrow windows, and he did not seem to find it wanting. He simply walked up the steps and knocked. Inside, Lady Meredith had marshaled her forces. The parlor had been tidied, the best china set out on a tray, and Charlotte was arranged artfully by the window with her embroidery, looking like a portrait of innocence. Frances stood near the mantelpiece, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had changed into a gown of sprigged muslin that was at least 2 seasons out of date, but it was the best she owned, and she had pinned up her hair with extra care. She was not trying to look beautiful, she knew that was impossible, but she was determined to look dignified. Alexander entered the room, and his presence seemed to fill it, making the worn furniture and faded wallpaper recede into insignificance. His eyes found Frances immediately, and something in his stern face softened. "Miss Meredith," he said, bowing. "Thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace," she replied, curtsying. "May I present my mother, Lady Meredith, and my sister, Miss Charlotte Meredith." Lady Meredith launched into a flurry of welcomes and curtsies and offers of tea, which Alexander accepted with grave politeness. But his gaze kept returning to Frances, as though she were the only person in the room he truly saw. For half an hour, they made stilted small talk. Lady Meredith chattered about the weather, the season, and the shocking price of ribbons, while Charlotte simpered and blushed and dropped her embroidery twice. Frances said very little, but she watched the Duke with a keen, assessing gaze. He was not what she expected. Under the polished manners, there was a deep reserve, a sorrow that clung to him like a shadow. He spoke carefully, as though every word cost him something. At last, he set down his teacup and turned to Frances. "I wonder if I might beg a favor. The day is fine, and I have my carriage outside. Would you do me the honor of a drive through the park?" Lady Meredith nearly choked on her tea in her eagerness to accept on Frances's behalf. "Of course, Your Grace." Frances would be delighted. "Wouldn't you, my dear?" Frances had little choice. She nodded and rose, allowing the Duke to escort her out to the carriage. As they drove away, she saw the curtains twitch in half a dozen windows along the street. By nightfall, the news would be all over London. The carriage was luxuriously appointed, with velvet cushions and silver fittings, and the horses moved at a smooth, steady pace. Alexander sat opposite Frances, his long legs stretched out before him, his expression thoughtful. "I apologize for the formality of that visit," he said. "I know your mother was trying very hard to impress me, and I appreciate the effort. But I wanted to speak with you privately." "You have your wish," Frances said. "Though I must warn you, if you are seen driving me in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, the gossip will be brutal." "I am counting on it," he said calmly. "I want the world to know that I have chosen you. Not for your fortune or your beauty or your connections, but for your honesty. I want every scheming mother in London to understand that their games will not work on me anymore." Frances stared at him. "Chosen me for what? We barely know each other." "Then let us get to know each other," he said. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am asking for a chance. Spend time with me. Let me learn who you are, and let me show you who I am. If, in the end, you find that you cannot bear me, I will bow out gracefully. But I do not think that will happen." "You are very confident," she said, but her voice trembled slightly. "I am not confident," he admitted. "I am terrified. I have not opened my heart to anyone in years. But you make me want to try. The carriage entered the park, and they fell silent as they joined the parade of elegant vehicles and riders. Alexander acknowledged the bows and curtsies of passing acquaintances with cold nods, but his attention remained fixed on Frances. She felt the weight of all those watching eyes, and she drew herself up straighter. If she was to be the subject of gossip, she would not cower. "Tell me about your life," Alexander said. "Not the version you give to society. The truth." Frances considered for a moment, then began to speak. She told him about her father's gentle, scholarly nature, how he had spent his days translating Greek texts while the estate crumbled around him. She told him about her mother's relentless anxiety, her desperation to see Charlotte married before the money ran out entirely. She told him about the small, quiet joys she clung to, her books, her long walks in the countryside, her secret habit of sketching landscapes when no one was looking. "You sketch?" Alexander's interest sharpened. "I would love to see your work. It is nothing special. Just a way to capture moments before they disappear." She hesitated, then added, "I used to dream of being an artist, but that is not a suitable ambition for a baronet's daughter. So I keep it to myself." "I understand," he said. "I used to dream of being an astronomer. I loved the stars when I was a boy. But a duke cannot spend his nights staring at the heavens. He has estates to manage, tenants to look after, a family name to uphold. That is a lonely kind of duty," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them. It was not love, not yet, but a profound recognition, as if two solitary souls had found each other in the dark. Over the following weeks, Alexander Blackwood pursued Frances Meredith with a quiet, determined persistence that astonished society. He called at the house every day, always with some small offering, a book he thought she might enjoy, a bunch of violets from a street cellar, a sketch of the stars he had drawn from memory. He took her to museums and galleries, to quiet bookshops and secluded gardens. He introduced her to his sister, Lady Margaret, who was a kind, plain-spoken woman in her 40s, and Margaret took an immediate liking to Frances. "She is not like the others," Margaret told her brother privately. "She does not simper or scheme. I think she genuinely cares for you." "I know she does," Alexander said. "That is what frightens me." Lady Honoria, meanwhile, was growing desperate. She watched Alexander's courtship with mounting fury, and she intensified her plans. She had already secured Mr. Croft's cooperation. The merchant had called on Sir John Meredith and offered to settle all his debts in exchange for Frances's hand in marriage. Sir John, cornered by his creditors and unaware of the Duke's deepening interest, had given his tentative consent. He had not yet told Frances, dreading the confrontation. Honoria also began to circulate subtle, poisonous rumors. She hinted in drawing rooms and over tea that Miss Meredith was a fortune hunter of the most brazen sort, that she had entrapped the Duke through some unsavory means, that she was not to be trusted. Some people believed her, others were simply eager for scandal. The whispers grew louder, and Frances felt their sting. One afternoon, as she walked through the park with Alexander, she broached the subject directly. "People are saying terrible things about me," she said. "They call me a schemer, a social climber. They say I have trapped you with some sort of trick." Alexander's face darkened. "I know. I have heard the rumors. They are being spread deliberately by someone who wishes to harm you." "Who?" "Lady Honoria Pemberton," he said, and his voice was cold. She was my late wife's friend, and she has always wanted more from me than I was willing to give. I believe she sees you as a threat. Francis absorbed this. Then she is more dangerous than I thought. A jealous woman with a grudge can do a great deal of damage. I will protect you, Alexander said. I will not let her hurt you. But even as he spoke the words, he knew the danger was far greater than Francis realized. Honoria had visited him 2 days earlier, in private, and she had brought the letters. She had laid them out on his desk, Catherine's loopy handwriting sprawling across the pages, and she had made her position very clear. I have kept these secret for your sake, she had said, her voice honeyed with false sympathy. But if you continue this foolish infatuation with Miss Meredith, I will have no choice but to make them public. Imagine the scandal, Alexander. The late Duchess running away with a footman. Your own honor tarnished forever. The Ton will never forgive you. He had stared at her, his blood running cold. What do you want? I want what I have always wanted, Honoria said. To be your wife. Marry me, and these letters will never see the light of day. I will be a devoted duchess, and we can forget this whole unfortunate episode. I will never marry you, he said. You disgust me. Then you leave me no choice. She had gathered up the letters and swept out of the room, her triumph evident in every line of her body. Now, walking in the park with Francis, Alexander felt the trap closing around him. He could not tell her the truth, not yet. The shame of Catherine's betrayal was too raw, too personal. And he could not bear to see the disappointment in Francis's eyes if she learned what his wife had been, what he had failed to see. So he said nothing, and the secret festered between them like an unhealed wound. The blow came a week later, on a rainy Tuesday evening. Frances was in her room, sketching by candlelight, when her father knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a reply. Sir John Meredith was a tall, stooped man with gentle eyes and a permanent air of distraction, but tonight his face was gray with worry. Frances, he said, I must speak with you. She set down her pencil, her heart sinking. What is it, Papa? He sat down heavily on the edge of her bed. I have been a foolish man. I have let my love of books and ideas blind me to the practical realities of life. And now I have brought ruin upon our family. She went to him and took his hands. Tell me. The debts, he said hoarsely. They are worse than you know. The investment failed completely, and I borrowed more to cover the losses. The creditors are calling in the loans. If I cannot pay, we will lose everything, this house, the land, the income that keeps Charlotte and your mother secure. We will be destitute. Frances felt the floor tilt beneath her. How much? He named a sum that made her head spin. It was far more than they could ever hope to scrape together. I have been offered a solution, he said, not meeting her eyes. A gentleman has offered to settle all my debts in exchange for your hand in marriage. His name is Mr. Reginald Croft. He is a man of means, and he is willing to take you with only a small dowry. The world went very still. Mr. Croft, she repeated. The merchant? Papa, he is a coarse, unkind man. I have heard stories about him. He treats his servants terribly, and he has a reputation for cruelty. I know, Sir John said miserably. But I see no other way. The Duke's attention may be flattering, but he has made no formal offer, and even if he did, I cannot hold off the creditors much longer. We need a solution now, not in some distant future. Frances pulled her hands away. She felt cold and hollow, as though all the warmth had been drained from her body. You are asking me to sacrifice myself. I am asking you to save your family, he whispered. I have no right to ask it, but I am begging you. She did not weep. Weeping was a luxury she could not afford. She simply sat there, her mind racing through every alternative and finding none. Alexander had not spoken of marriage. He had spoken of getting to know each other, of a future that was still uncertain. And here was her father, broken and desperate, offering her a way to save them all, if she was willing to destroy her own life in the process. I will think on it, she said at last. Give me tonight. Sir John nodded and left the room, his shoulders bowed with shame. Frances sat alone for a long time, staring at the unfinished sketch on her table. It was a drawing of Alexander, done from memory, the strong lines of his face, the sadness in his eyes, the way his mouth curved up at the corner when he almost smiled. She had not meant to draw him, but her pencil had moved of its own accord. Now the drawing seemed like a cruel mockery of what could never be. The next morning, before she could speak to Alexander, the scandal broke. It started with a paragraph in one of the gossip sheets, a lurid account of the late Duchess of Kelvinridge's secret love affair and her plan to abandon her husband. The article quoted extensively from letters that were clearly authentic, and it painted Alexander as a cuckold who had driven his wife to her death through neglect and coldness. By noon, the story was on every lip in London. Frances read the article in stunned disbelief. She did not believe Alexander was capable of cruelty, but the letters were damning. They showed a side of Catherine that was desperate and reckless, and they made Alexander seem like a man who had failed his wife in the most fundamental way. The gossip sheets reveled in the scandal, and the Ton, always hungry for blood, turned on the Duke of Kelvinridge with savage glee. Alexander did not call that day. He sent no message. The house in Berkeley Square remained shuttered, and rumors flew that he had fled London to escape the disgrace. Frances felt her heart splintering. She had trusted him, had begun to love him, and now it seemed his whole life was built on secrets and shame. She did not know what to believe. That afternoon, Lady Honoria paid a call. She arrived in a swirl of silk and perfume, her smile as sharp as a blade. Lady Meredith, flustered and anxious, ushered her into the parlor, and Honoria settled herself on the best chair as though she owned the house. "My dear Miss Meredith," she said to Frances, her voice dripping with false kindness. "I came to express my concern. This dreadful business about the Duke, how shocking. You must be devastated." Frances kept her face perfectly still. "I am sure the truth will come out in time." "The truth?" Honoria laughed, a brittle, tinkling sound. "The truth is that His Grace has been deceiving everyone for years. His wife was a wanton, and he was too proud to see it. Now he is ruined, and anyone associated with him will be ruined too. You would be wise to distance yourself. Is that why you came? To warn me?" "I came to offer you a way out," Honoria said. "You have an offer of marriage from Mr. Croft, I understand. Accept it. Marry him, and leave London before the scandal engulfs you. It is the only sensible course." Frances looked at the beautiful, venomous woman before her, and a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "You are behind this," she said slowly. "You released those letters." Honoria's smile did not waver. "Prove it." "Why? Why would you do such a thing?" "Because I have loved Alexander Blackwood since the day I met him," Honoria said, her mask slipping for just an instant. "I was his wife's confidant, and I watched Catherine toy with him, betray him, make a fool of him. I was there when she died, you know. I rode out after her that morning. I heard her say things about him that would curdle your blood. And I kept her secrets because I thought, in time, he would turn to me. He would need me. And he did, for a while. But then you came along, with your plain face and your honest eyes, and you took him away. I will not allow it. The cold certainty in her voice sent a chill down Frances's spine. You are monstrous. I am determined. There is a difference. Honoria rose, smoothing her skirts. Marry Mr. Croft, Miss Meredith. It is your only chance to save your family and escape the ruin that is coming. If you refuse, I will make sure your name is dragged through the mud alongside the Duke's. Your sister will never find a husband. Your father will be thrown into debtor's prison. Think carefully. She swept out, leaving Frances standing alone in the parlor, her mind reeling. That evening, Frances sat down with her parents and told them she would accept Mr. Croft's proposal. Her mother wept with relief. Her father could not look at her. Charlotte, when she heard, burst into angry tears and accused Frances of throwing her life away. But Frances was resolute. She could see no other path. Alexander was disgraced, possibly guilty of coldness beyond imagining. She could not count on him. She could only save her family, even if it meant destroying herself. She wrote a brief, formal note to Alexander, telling him that she could no longer see him, that she wished him well, and that she was to be married to another. She did not explain. She could not bear to. Then she closed her heart and prepared to become Mrs. Reginald Croft. The days that followed were a blur of misery. Mr. Croft called several times, his manner oily and proprietorial. He spoke of the marriage settlements, of the house he would buy in the country, of the children he expected Frances to bear him. She listened with numb detachment, nodding when required, her thoughts far away. Alexander did not reply to her note. She heard nothing from him, and she told herself it was for the best. The scandal had consumed him. He had no time for a penniless spinster who had turned her back on him. She had made her choice, and now she must live with it. But Charlotte, in secret, was doing some investigating of her own. She had always been sharper than people gave her credit for, and she had overheard enough of Lady Honoria's veiled threats to suspect that something was very wrong. She did not trust Mr. Croft, and she did not trust Honoria. So, while Frances was drowning in wedding preparations, Charlotte began to dig. She started with the servants. A maid in Honoria's household, a young girl named Bess, had been dismissed a week earlier for supposed theft. Charlotte tracked her down in a dingy lodging house and bought her story with a handful of coins. Bess, it turned out, had not stolen anything. She had been sacked because she had seen Honoria tampering with the saddle of the late Duchess's horse on the morning of the accident. Honoria had claimed she was merely adjusting the girth, but Bess had seen the look on her face, and it was not the look of a helpful friend. It was the look of a woman who wanted something terrible to happen. Charlotte felt the ground shift beneath her. She pressed further, using the last of her pin money to bribe a groom who had worked at the Kelvinridge stables at the time. The groom confirmed that Lady Honoria had been in the stables alone that morning, and that the Duchess's horse, usually a placid creature, had been strangely skittish when it was led out. No one had thought to question it at the time, because the Duchess had been in a fury and had ridden off before anyone could stop her. Armed with these testimonies, Charlotte went to the one person she thought might listen, Lady Margaret, the Duke's sister. She arrived at Lady Margaret's townhouse, breathless and trembling, and poured out the whole story. Margaret listened in growing horror. "Are you saying that Lady Honoria caused Catherine's death?" That it was not an accident at all? I believe so, Charlotte said. And I believe she is blackmailing your brother with those letters. She wants to force him to marry her, and she is using Francis to do it. She made Francis accept Mr. Croft's proposal by threatening to ruin our family. Margaret's face hardened into lines of cold fury. Where is my brother? I must speak to him at once. Alexander was at his London house, sitting alone in the dark library, a half-empty decanter of brandy at his elbow. He had not slept in 3 days. The scandal had broken over him like a tidal wave, and he had retreated into solitude, too proud to defend himself and too heartsick to fight. Francis's note had been the final blow. She was marrying someone else, and he could not blame her. He had brought nothing but shame and trouble into her life. Margaret found him there, and she did not waste time on gentleness. She told him everything Charlotte had revealed. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at her. Then a terrible light kindled in his eyes, a fury so profound that it seemed to burn away the grief and despair that had consumed him. Honoria killed Catherine, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She killed her, and she used her own guilt to blackmail me. Yes, Margaret said. And now she is trying to destroy Francis. We must stop her. Alexander rose, and the old, cold Duke that London feared came back in full force. We will do more than stop her, he said. We will see her punished for what she has done. But first, I need to save Francis. He sent for his solicitor and set in motion a plan that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Then he went to confront Mr. Reginald Croft. The merchant was in his counting house when Alexander strode in, his face like thunder. Croft took one look at him and went pale. Your Grace, he stammered. What an unexpected. I know about your arrangement with Lady Honoria, Alexander said, cutting him off. I know she promised you money or favor in exchange for marrying Miss Meredith and removing her from my path. I also know about your business dealings, the illegal loans, the false weights, the bribes to customs officials. I have a report from my solicitor that could see you transported, or worse. Croft's eyes bulged. You cannot prove any of that. I can prove enough to make your life very unpleasant, Alexander said. But I am prepared to offer you a choice. You will sign a document releasing Miss Meredith from your engagement, and you will leave England within the week, never to return. In exchange, I will not hand this evidence over to the authorities. Refuse, and I will destroy you. Croft sputtered and blustered, but he knew when he was beaten. Within the hour, the engagement was dissolved, and Francis Meredith was free. The final confrontation took place at Lady Honoria's elegant townhouse. Alexander arrived unannounced, with Margaret and Charlotte and a magistrate in tow. Honoria received them in her drawing room, her composure cracking at the sight of so many hostile faces. What is the meaning of this? She demanded. The meaning, Alexander said, is that I know what you did. You killed Catherine. You sabotaged her saddle because you were jealous of her, because you wanted me for yourself. And then you used her letters to try to force me into marriage. You tried to destroy an innocent woman out of spite. Honoria laughed, but it was a high, strained sound. You have no proof. It is the word of a disgraced maid and a stable hand against mine. I am a viscount's widow. No one will believe you. The groom kept a piece of the saddle strap, Margaret said quietly. He thought it might be worth something someday. It shows clear signs of being cut with a knife. We also have a witness who saw you in the stables that morning. And we have your own correspondence with Mr. Croft, which he was only too happy to hand over in exchange for leniency. The color drained from Honoria's face. She staggered back, her hands gripping the edge of a table. "You cannot do this. I loved you. Everything I did for you." "You did it for yourself," Alexander said. "And you will answer for it." The magistrate stepped forward and placed a hand on Honoria's arm. She did not resist. She was taken away, her screams echoing through the house, and the long nightmare was over at last. Frances was sitting in the garden of her family's rented house, a book of poetry open on her lap but unread, when Alexander found her. It was a cool, gray afternoon, and the first leaves of autumn were drifting down from the trees. She looked up at the sound of footsteps, and her heart lurched. He was thinner than she remembered, and there were new shadows under his eyes, but he was here, alive, and looking at her with an expression that made her chest ache. "I received word that my engagement was dissolved," she said, her voice unsteady. "Is that your doing?" "Yes," he said. "I could not let you marry that man. Not when I knew the truth." "The truth?" She searched his face. "I heard about Lady Honoria. Charlotte told me everything. She said you were innocent, that it was all a lie." "I was not entirely innocent," Alexander said quietly. "I was blind, and I was proud, and I kept secrets I should have shared. Catherine was unfaithful to me, and I knew it, deep down. But I could not bear to face it. I let my guilt and my shame build walls around my heart, and I nearly lost you because of it." Frances rose, the book sliding forgotten to the bench. "You did not lose me," she said. "I am still here." He reached into his coat and withdrew the small leather case she had seen once before. He opened it and showed her the miniature portrait, the girl under the apple tree, still smiling after all these years. "This is how I have always seen you," he said. "The girl who spoke to me as a friend, who saw past the title and the grief and the pride. The woman who ignored me in a ballroom because she had better things to do than chase a duke. I love you, Frances Meredith. Not for your beauty or your fortune, but for the courage and honesty of your soul. I think I have loved you since that night in Yorkshire, and I have been too afraid to admit it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I always have. But I was so afraid that I was not enough." "You are everything," he said, and he drew her into his arms. They stood there in the quiet garden, holding each other, while the leaves fell around them like confetti. The world was still full of scandal and gossip and sharp tongues, but in that moment, none of it mattered. They had found each other, against all odds, and that was the only miracle either of them needed. They were married a month later, in a small stone church in the village near Kelvinridge, far from the prying eyes of London. The ceremony was quiet and simple, attended only by family and a handful of true friends. Charlotte served as bridesmaid, radiant with happiness, and Lady Margaret wept unashamedly into her handkerchief. Sir John Meredith, his debts quietly paid by a grateful son-in-law, gave the bride away with tears in his eyes. After the wedding, Alexander took Frances to the great house at Kelvinridge. It was an ancient, sprawling place, full of dark corridors and dusty portraits and the lingering ghost of Catherine's unhappy presence. But Frances walked through it with her head held high, and she began, slowly and gently, to fill it with light. She turned one of the unused rooms into a studio, where she could sketch and paint to her heart's content. She reorganized the library, discovering first editions that had not been touched in decades. She walked the grounds every morning, learning the names of the tenants and the servants, earning their respect with her quiet kindness and her refusal to put on airs. And at night, she sat with Alexander in the private parlor, and they talked about everything and nothing, building a life out of shared silences and sudden laughter. One evening, as autumn deepened into winter and the first frost silvered the lawns, Alexander led her to the tower room at the top of the house. It was a circular chamber with a domed ceiling, and in the center stood a magnificent telescope, its brass gleaming in the candlelight. "I had it brought from London," he said. "I thought we might look at the stars together." Frances gazed at him, her heart too full for words. "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said. "Every conversation, every glance, every moment since that night in Yorkshire. You told me once that you loved the stars but could never afford a telescope. Now you have one." She stepped to the telescope and pressed her eye to the lens. The night sky leaped into brilliant focus, a cascade of silver and velvet and cold, distant fire. She gasped, and he came to stand behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "They are beautiful," she breathed. "So are you," he said. She turned and looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw the truth that had been there all along. She had been wanted, not for anything she could give or do, but simply for herself. And that was the greatest gift of all. They stood together under the dome of stars, and the past, with all its grief and secrets and heartbreak, faded at last into silence. What remained was a love that had been hard-won and deeply earned, a love that would sustain them through all the years to come. Outside, the world went on as it always did, with its gossip and its glitter and its endless hunger for scandal. But inside the tower room at Kelvinridge, two souls who had found each other against every expectation rested in the quiet certainty that they were, at last, exactly where they belonged. And if, on certain clear nights, the servants happened to glance up at the tower window and see two figures silhouetted against the starlight, they only smiled and went about their business, knowing that some stories are too precious to be disturbed. The Duke of Kelvinridge had turned away 100 women, but he crossed a ballroom for the one who ignored him. And that single, reckless act of honesty had led him home. Thank you for listening to this story of being seen, being chosen, and being loved for exactly who you are. If you believe that the quiet, overlooked souls of the world deserve their own happily ever after, then hit that like button and subscribe with notifications on. Every subscription tells me you want more stories where honesty means more than a title, and where love is earned, not given away lightly. Now I want to hear from you. What was the moment in Frances and Alexander's journey that made your heart ache or smile? And which corner of the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and your words make this community what it is. Until the next story, remember, the right person will cross the whole room for you, even when you're not trying to be seen.